The movie begins with Brian Godlock frantically running through the streets of his neighborhood. In the distance, there is the sound of gunfire, and he chases after the sound. He then spots two cars of rival gangsters who are in an intense shootout with each other. One set of gangsters manage to kill the rival driver, causing their car to crash. The gangsters are coming towards Brian's direction, so he searches until he finds a metal pipe. He then lay-waits the car, and as it comes close, Brian smashes their windshield, almost causing them to crash. The men then turn their guns on him, forcing Brian to run for his life. He then spots a forklift, and on instinct he uses it to jump over the gangster's truck, which decapitates one man. Brian is however shot in the back by one of the survivors, and the man, who looks like he lost a fight with his tattoo artist, brutally shoots him in the throat and leaves him for dead. Brian is rushed to the hospital clinging for life, with his wife Saya praying for his speedy recovery. The doctors manage to save Brian's life, and after a while, he is recovering in the hospital. He is soon visited by Detective Vassal, who looks him over then leaves his card. After a few days, Brian awakens, and Saya rushes to his side with tears of joy in her eyes. Brian begins therapy learning to walk again, but he has lost his voice in the attack, which torments him as he tries screaming at himself in the mirror with tears in his eyes. Brian is gifted an artificial voice box by Saya, but the frustration gets the better of him, and he begins to shut down. Brian is discharged from the hospital after a while, and I'm sure you're itching to know what happened, and we will get there soon. Saya drives Brian back home where he passes signs of a clearly run-down city, overflowing with gang violence and degenerates. The couple eventually return home in silence, the place where tragedy struck. Brian recalls better times when his son Taylor was still alive and the two enjoyed playing in the front yard. Brian is in tears as he stares at the now empty yard. Inside, Taylor's toys still sit on the table, along with the Christmas tree with his presents still wrapped. Brian breaks down once more in tears, unable to cope with the loss of his boy, and Saya hugs him as he cries in anguish. On a table nearby, he sees the news report of the slaying of Taylor by gangsters, and he rips it. He goes to the kitchen and grabs a bottle of vodka. He mouths to Saya to help him, but she breaks down in tears, not knowing what to do. The next day, Saya is getting ready for work, and it's clear that Brian did not sleep in the bed that night. She finds him drinking alone in another room and decides to text him, asking if he saw her keys, but he hasn't. Memories of Taylor still flood his mind, and he goes to his son's room, where it is untouched. Brian sits on his bed with tears before laying down, recalling the feeling of having his son beside him. Brian then goes to sit in the front yard, remembering the day tragedy struck. The family was in the front yard, and Taylor was learning to ride his new bike when two rival gangsters drove past in an intense shootout. Brian and Saya then realized that Taylor was shot and passed away right in their arms. Unable to sit around any longer, Brian rushes to his work shed where he clears off all the vodka bottles before grabbing his tools. Saya returns home and takes a minute in her car before heading inside. She does not see Brian anywhere around and texts him. Then she sees Brian and sees him ignore the message. Brian finds Detective Vassal's card and heads over to the station to speak with him. Brian sits in his office waiting to speak with him when he sees pictures of local gangsters and begins taking photos, until he spots the gangster who shot him, named Playa. Vassal finally returns to his office, but Brian is already leaving. He returns home where he pins the pictures of the gangsters to his wall, preparing to do his own investigations. He then marks the 24th of December as the day he will kill them all. Brian then begins to work out and watches videos of how to wield a knife. As his workout continues, so does the distance between him and Saya. But Brian does not relent and is single-minded on revenge. A few months later, Brian buys himself a used car, ecstatic about getting closer to his goal. While Saya is burdened with bills, she hears him working at nights modifying his car, and she also begins to brake. Brian also gets himself firearms training, but initially sucks at hitting his target. Nonetheless, he buys himself a stash of weapons and begins to listen to the police radios. Finally, one night, Brian pulls himself away to spend time with Saya, who misses him, but has now decided to move in with her mother and leaves. Brian then takes out his anger on his training dummy. He then takes his car out for a spin, trying to sharpen up his driving skills. By October, Brian begins to stake out the gangsters' known hideout and take pictures of their operations. He then spots Playa about to get some cheeks, then sees a man leaving in a car and snaps the plate. Brian is now a muscular and athletic powerhouse and a skilled driver, able to maneuver his car to perfection. At the range, Brian can hit his target with rapid succession. Those gangsters don't stand a chance at this point. One day, Brian sees a little boy who looks just like Taylor and hugs him. But that's not his kid. He returns to his car when he spots Playa handing out cash to the little kids around him and goes for his knife, but manages to hold himself back as there are too many kids around. Brian then bumps into a gangster and is shoved to the ground, and their girl pours ice cream all over him, adding insult to injury. That night, Brian prepares himself. On the 23rd of December, he tracks down the home of one of the gangsters and breaks in. The man hears sounds and comes to check, but Brian knocks him down. The gangster is hogtied to the roof of Brian's garage, and he comes in wearing a welding mask. He cuts the gangster down before handing him papers and a pen demanding info on the gang. Brian takes a seat, but the gangster attacks him and manages to free himself. The man grabs Brian's knife and attacks, stabbing him in the leg. The two struggle, but Brian eventually stabs the man with a screwdriver before tackling him to the ground. The man fights back, and Brian is having a hard time, but is able to overpower the man and beat him into submission. On the 24th, Brian begins to gear up, strapping body armor to himself and readying his guns. He then writes a note before taking one last look at Taylor's room, taking it all in as he may not return. He then goes by where Saya is staying and sees her drawing a picture of Taylor as her way of coping. He brings a gift to Taylor's grave, as it is his birthday, and sits alone with his son where he cries after a very long time, then opens the gift for Taylor. That night, Detective Vassal hears a noise and comes checking with his gun, but opens to door only to see the bound and gagged gangster, along with a note. The cops come by later to pick him up, and Vassal opens the note to see a message from Brian, telling him that he will take care of what he should have. Along with the note is a flash drive with detailed info on the gang, along with evidence that Brian has collected over the past year. Brian is driving when he hears a police report about gang activity and heads over. He sees two gangsters beating and robbing a couple. As the gangster walks away, Brian pins them against a wall using his car and stabs one before taking off with the other on his car. Brian tries to throw the man off, and when he pulls a gun, Brian disarms him and shoots him dead. Brian then throws up, taking his first life. He goes to the gang compound where he throws a wrapped package over the wall. A man brings the package to Playa, his boss, which turns out to be the fingers of the dead men. There is another massive gang shootout in the city, with multiple cops hit and taking cover. Brian pulls up to the scene and sees a female cop get shot. He then drives into the mix, shooting and killing the gangsters he can, while one man is live streaming the car directly to Playa. The gangsters fire on the car, but Brian manages to push them back. He tries saving the cop, but she gets shot on her way in and dies right next to him. Brian pushes her out the car before spotting the guy streaming the entire incident and sends him flying with the car. Brian picks up his phone, sees the live stream, and shoots him dead for Playa to see. Playa somehow figures out that it is Brian and sends a message to his gangsters to hunt him down. The thugs, who were in the middle of beating up a rival, see a car approaching, which turns out to be Brian, and he stares them down grimly before driving away. He then pulls over on a bridge, looking at an old music toy that belonged to Taylor, and he listens to the music, reminding himself of why he is doing this. He sets off once more, but the gangsters catch up with him and begin chasing him through the city. Brian pulls a 180 and comes face to face with the men, before pulling off a sick drift to shoot one of the men inside. Brian takes off once more, but the men are on him in an instant. Pause. A biker also joins the chase, and they open fire on Brian, forcing him to speed off. He runs into a roadblock and gets pinned between two trucks, both with gangsters shooting at him. He manages to kill one man, before pulling a pit maneuver on the front truck, causing both trucks to collide in a tangled mess. The biker is still on his tail, firing off shots at Brian's now mangled car. The biker gets to the window, but Brian grabs his gun, causing him to lose his bike, then drives him straight into a wall. Brian then stops to catch his breath once more. Detective Vassal is sitting in his car looking over the evidence that Brian showed to him, and then sets out to the gang headquarters. Hearing about the attack on his men, Playa sends a message for all his goons to return to his building. Brian pulls over just outside the gang's building, listening to Taylor's toy and remembering better days. He ensures all his guns are ready before seeing the message Playa sent out to his goons on a phone he stole. Seeing an opportunity, Brian gears up and sets out on a motorcycle to finish what the gangsters started. Brian manages to slip into the hideout right behind a convoy of gangsters, and a gunfight erupts. He blows up his motorcycle, causing a massive explosion, setting the men on fire. Meanwhile, his men are being wiped out. Playa is having a good time with his female baddie. Brian makes his way up the building, hearing the shouting men and taking the time to catch his breath. The armed gangsters start making their way down the staircase, and Brian starts blasting them as they appear, and fighting when necessary. His training begins to show, as none of the men stand a chance against his onslaught. He switches to his sidearm and begins catching bodies once more. He tries reloading his shotgun, but takes 3 bullets to his body armor and falls but easily recovers. He sets an explosive trap in the main hallway, but is then suddenly attacked by a gangster named Ruiz. Ruiz is much stronger, throwing Brian around easily and disarming him when he tries to go for his gun. Brian eats some nasty punches, but when some gangsters set off the bomb trap distracting Ruiz, Brian manages to stab him in the shoulder. Ruiz does not stay down and hits Brian with a suplex move. Meanwhile, Detective Vassal has made his way into the building, passing all the dead bodies on his way. Brian and Ruiz are both out of breath. They both go for guns, and Ruiz opens fire, but Brian manages to disarm him and blow his head off. Detective Vassal comes under attack, but manages to skillfully kill all the men coming at him. He finds Brian and the two hold guns on each other in silence, but Vassal lowers his pistol, showing that he is on Brian's side. The two then come under heavy gunfire from Playa's girl and go for cover. She reloads just in time to hit Brian, then also hits Vassal in the arm. Brian uses the chaos to crawl up to her, then hold a gun to her head, forcing her to drop her gun. Brian cannot bring himself to shoot her, so she pulls a pistol and shoots him twice, before shooting Vassal. Seeing this, Brian then shoots her dead. Both Brian and Vassal painfully recover, and Brian grabs his pistol and goes looking for Playa. The two come face to face and begin to shoot at each other, but Brian takes too many shots to his vest and falls. Playa is about to finish Brian off, but Vassal is able to shoot him in the back, giving Brian the chance to tackle Playa to the ground, beat his face in, before strangling the life out of him while he fights. Brian then stares into his eyes while life leaves him, picturing a happy Taylor smiling at him. Vassal crawls over to Brian, who is now seeing Taylor's short life flash before his eyes. He even sees what Taylor's future would have been like. We then see Saya at Taylor's grave, where Brian's toy is revealed to be a train which encircles the headstone. She reads a note from him before leaving it at the headstone. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more movies like this. Thanks for watching.